August 13, 1940. Adlertag, Eagle Day. A German fighter pilot checks his watch over the channel, sunlight glinting off his cockpit glass, and grins at his wingman through the canopy. Below him, the white cliffs of England look close enough to touch. Behind him, over 1,000 aircraft are forming up across occupied France, the largest air armada Europe has ever seen. Command has told them this will be quick. Weeks, maybe less. The RAF, they've been briefed, is finished a broken air force. Its best squadrons shattered over Dunkirk, its remaining pilots exhausted, its factories unable to replace what's already been lost. Hermann Göring himself has promised the Frere that his Luftwaffe will sweep the skies clear within days. So when this pilot rolls his fighter toward the coast, he isn't hunting, he's mopping up. Then the radio crackles. Spitfires, not 2 or 3, stragglers from some broken squadron limping home, a full formation, climbing hard, already at altitude, already turning into the sun behind him. Somehow, exactly where they shouldn't be. Exactly when they shouldn't be there. His grin disappears. Within minutes, tracer fire rips past his canopy, and a friend's aircraft spirals down trailing black smoke into the channel below. This was supposed to be over by autumn. Instead, it was about to become the first battle in history fought entirely in the sky, and a story of how a handful of pilots, backed by an invention almost nobody in Britain's own military wanted to fund, turned Hitler's certain victory into his first true defeat. To understand why the Luftwaffe was so certain of victory, you have to understand what June 1940 had done to Britain. France had fallen in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, a country with one of the largest armies in Europe, gone, while the world watched in disbelief. At Dunkirk, over 300,000 British and Allied troops had escaped annihilation only by abandoning nearly all their equipment on the beaches. RAF Fighter Command had bled heavily over France too, flying constant sorties to cover the evacuation, losing pilots and aircraft it could not easily replace. By July, Britain stood completely alone. No ally left standing on the continent. An invasion fleet was already massing across the channel, Hitler's Operation Sea Lion, and there was one condition attached to it. Before a single German soldier crossed the water, the Luftwaffe had to own the sky above it. No air superiority, no invasion. It was that simple. And on paper, the numbers were brutal. Germany could field well over 2,000 combat aircraft, crewed by pilots hardened by campaigns in Poland, Norway, and France. Britain had roughly 600 fighters to defend the entire country, and nowhere near enough trained pilots to fly them in relentless daily rotation. Some squadrons would fly 4, 5, 6 sorties in a single day, landing only to refuel, rearm, and go straight back up. Churchill would later call these men the few. At the time, nobody knew if the few would be enough. Every RAF pilot lost was a pilot Britain could not quickly replace. Every airfield destroyed was a base that might not reopen before the invasion barges started moving. This wasn't a war of attrition Britain could realistically win by simply matching Germany plane for plane, pilot for pilot. If Fighter Command was going to survive the summer, it needed something the Luftwaffe didn't have. Something that didn't depend on outnumbering the enemy in the air. It needed to know exactly where the enemy was before the enemy even crossed the coast. The man who had quietly built that answer had spent most of the 1930s being treated like Britain's most tedious problem. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding Stuffy, his own subordinates called him behind his back, only half affectionately was not the dashing charismatic commander popular history usually remembers. He was withdrawn, humorless in meetings, and utterly uninterested in the political games that decided military budgets, which made him easy for the Air Ministry to overrule. For years, Dowding had pushed for a radical, unproven idea, a chain of radar stations along Britain's coast, feeding real-time information into control rooms that could scramble fighter squadrons to precisely the right place, at precisely the right altitude, before the enemy even arrived. Traditionalists in the Air Ministry saw it as an expensive gamble on unproven science money that could go toward more fighters, more pilots, more of what everyone understood how to count. Dowding was overruled more than once. He was quietly due to retire before the war even began, kept on almost reluctantly, because no obvious replacement existed. Then came the summer of 1940, and a decision that nearly cost Dowding his career all over again. As France collapsed, French commanders begged Churchill for more RAF fighter squadrons to help hold the line. Churchill was sympathetic. The pressure from Paris and from parts of his own government was intense. Dowding refused to let it happen without a fight. He walked into a war cabinet meeting, and in a document that would later be called one of the most consequential memos of the entire war, laid out in cold, exact numbers, exactly how many fighters Britain had left, and exactly how few it would take to lose the Battle of Britain before it even started. He won that argument. Barely. It made him few friends. Rivals within the RAF thought him stubborn, difficult, too cautious to inspire the fight ahead. But Dowding wasn't interested in being liked. He was interested in having enough fighters left, in August, to actually defend the country, even if it meant standing alone in a room full of furious generals and telling them no. What Dowding had actually built, by the summer of 1940, looked almost laughably fragile for something meant to stop the most powerful air force on Earth. Along the English coastline stood a string of tall steel pylons and wire aerials that chain home radar stations, clunky, half-finished-looking structures that some officers privately dismissed as an overpriced experiment. There was no glowing radar screen sweeping in neat circles like popular imagination pictures. Just faint blips on a cathode ray tube, interpreted by young servicewomen trained to estimate the size, height, and heading of incoming raids from little more than educated guesswork and practice. That raw information fed into a system just as unglamorous: the filter room. Then Fighter Command's operations rooms, where WAAF plotters pushed wooden markers across a giant table map with long croupier's rakes, translating radar blips into a live, constantly updating picture of the battle overhead. From there, sector controllers picked up telephones and scrambled specific squadrons to specific altitudes to meet specific threats, often with pilots airborne and climbing before German bombers had even finished forming up over France. To pilots trained the old way, visual spotters on clifftops, standing patrols flown blind and hoping to stumble into the enemy, it looked bureaucratic. Slow, over-engineered. Some fighter command pilots grumbled that they were being run by clerks with rakes and telephones instead of trusting their own instincts in the air. The Luftwaffe, for its part, barely understood what it was looking at. German intelligence knew Britain had radar towers. They were hardly a secret, visible for miles along the coast, but consistently underestimated what that network actually did. Early in the battle, Luftwaffe planners treated the towers as a minor nuisance, a target worth a few token raids, rather than the nervous system of Britain's entire air defense. It was, in the coldest possible sense, an absurd way to fight a war. Teenage girls pushing wooden blocks across a table, deciding in real time which pilots would fly toward German formations, outnumbering them 5 and 6 to 1. And it worked exactly as Dowding had designed it to. For German aircrews, the horror of the Battle of Britain wasn't really about losses. Air forces expect losses. It was about the growing, gnawing sense that something about this enemy simply didn't make sense. Luftwaffe bomber formations would cross the channel, expecting the element of surprise, and find RAF squadrons already climbing to meet them, already at altitude, already positioned with the sun behind their backs for the ideal attack. Again and again. Pilots began asking each other, half joking and half serious, how the British always seemed to know exactly where they were going before they got there. Rumors spread through Luftwaffe messes that bordered on superstition. Some pilots became convinced the British had spies embedded on every airbase in France, phoning ahead each time a raid took off. Nobody wanted to believe the truth that a chain of towers and a room full of women moving wooden blocks were reading their raids like an open book, in real time, every single day. That psychological weight compounded with every sortie. German fighter pilots, tasked with escorting slow, vulnerable bomber formations, found themselves flying at the absolute edge of their fuel range. Watching their gauges as much as watching for Spitfires every minute over England was a minute closer to a cold swim in the Channel if the fight ran long. Luftwaffe aircrew began referring to the stretch of water behind them, half bitterly, as the channel sickness, a dread that set in the moment English coastline came into view, because getting home was never guaranteed. And the RAF pilots who met them, exhausted as they were, started to sense something shifting too. Squadrons scrambled from grass airfields dotted across southern England, Biggin Hill, Kenley, Tangmere, North Weald, climbing hard into formations of German bombers and fighters that dwarfed their own numbers, and coming home having broken those formations apart before they ever reached their targets. By late August, as the Luftwaffe shifted its main effort toward destroying fighter commands' airfields and sector stations directly trying to blind the very system, grinding them down, the fighting reached its most desperate pitch. Airfields were cratered. Communication lines were cut. Some sector stations came dangerously close to being knocked out of the fight entirely. But the system Dowding built didn't just track the enemy. It decided, hour by hour, exactly how much of Britain's dwindling fighter strength to risk, and exactly when to hold squadrons back to fight another day. Not every part of that system worked as cleanly as Dowding intended, and the gap between what worked and what didn't would cost lives, and very nearly cost Britain the battle. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding 11 Group in the southeast, the group directly in the Luftwaffe's path to London, flew Dowding's philosophy almost to the letter. Small, fast, scrambled formations. Squadrons committed precisely, matched to the size of the threat, husbanding pilots and aircraft rather than gambling them all at once. It was unglamorous, methodical, and it worked. Time and again, 11 Group's fighters met German raids before they reached their targets, broke up their formations, and got home to fly again the next day. To the north, 12 Group's commander, Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, saw it differently. He championed what became known as the Big Wing, massed formations of 3, 4, even 5 squadrons assembling together before engaging. Designed to overwhelm German raids with sheer numbers rather than speed of response. On paper, it sounded devastating. In practice, it took time. Precious time that 11 Group's airfields under direct attack simply didn't have. On more than one critical day in late August and early September, Park requested urgent support from 12 Group squadrons to cover his airfields while his own fighters were airborne elsewhere, and watched the Big Wing arrive late. Its formations still climbing and assembling, while German bombers had already struck, already turned for home, already left craters across the runways below. The tactic that looked most impressive on paper proved, in the moment that mattered most, too slow to save the men and airfields it was meant to protect. And arrogance did not stop at tactics. In the political maneuvering that followed the battle, even as Fighter Command held, even as Hitler quietly postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely, rather than risk a channel crossing without air superiority, critics of Dowding and Park used the Big Wing controversy as a weapon. Leigh-Mallory and his allies argued, loudly and persistently, that a different approach could have won the battle faster, with fewer losses. Within months of victory, both Dowding and Park, the two men most responsible for winning the Battle of Britain, were quietly removed from their commands, sidelined by rivals who had never carried the weight of those August afternoons the way they had. Britain had just survived its darkest test in a century, and the men who built the system that saved it were shown the door by the very institution they'd saved. By the end of September 1940, Hitler had indefinitely postponed the invasion that Adlertag was supposed to guarantee. Along stretches of the English coast and countryside, the wreckage told the real story of that summer-downed German aircraft scattered across fields and hillsides. A graveyard of the Luftwaffe's confidence, spread across the very sky Göring had promised would belong to Germany within days. Dowding was gone from Fighter Command within months. Quietly retired, publicly thanked, and largely forgotten by the institution he'd just saved. Park was reassigned, his methods vindicated by history long before the RAF itself was willing to admit it. Somewhere in that wreckage, that grinning pilot from Eagle Day, the one who rolled his fighter toward the English coast expecting a mop-up operation. Not a fight, never got his name into any history book either. But his shock, in the seconds between certainty and tracer fire, was the same shock that swept through Luftwaffe crews all summer long. The growing, sinking realization that the enemy they had been told was finished somehow always knew exactly where they were coming from. They called the RAF's pilots finished. Britain's skies buried that idea instead.